Afghanistan. Remember that? He sold the weapons to the groups that were fighting the Contras against the Liberation Army in Nicaragua. They brought tons of cocaine back to the United States. And he also got the weapons from Iran via Lebanon. Lebanon was one of the biggest suppliers of opium and heroin in the United States as well. So you got to understand the context of the 80s. The context, they were trying to finish us off in the 80s. And the reason why is because it was a resurgence of everything that I talked about today. The Afrocentric movement, the sister you talked about, you know, the connection with all the Muslim groups and the government groups that were underground. A lot of those organizations that were underground in the 60s and 70s, a lot of those people got released in the late 70s and early 80s. Imam Jamil was locked up to the late 70s. He didn't get out to, you know, right around it because he was in prison for the COINTELPRO stuff. And so a lot of the resurgence of what we call empowerment in the black community started in the early 80s. The whole thing about the hip hop connected to, you know, the last poets, all of that came around. So the reason why I said that as a context before I introduced Damu is because this generation of young brothers and sisters that came into adulthood in the early 80s represent some of the best of what, you know, was produced after the 60s. And a lot of them came into manhood and womanhood in the late 80s. But obviously, clearly, by the time Reagan and them got through in the CIA and Oliver North, our community was in bad shape. Ricky Ross was bringing tons of cocaine, you know, through his connections from Cali to Cleveland and Cali to Cincinnati, and the Young Boys Incorporated coming through Toledo with the Primos. Back then they were called Primos, and I'm sure it strung out a lot of Toledo, right? Yeah. The YBI was a very violent paramilitary group that was connected to Oliver North and them through the opium triangle, because they were some of the ones that brought the heroin in when Frank Lucas was bringing the heroin in New York. Vessels of the YBI was connected to that in Detroit, and Toledo was one of the first stopovers. Very little known black history fact, and I'll bring him up. Crack wasn't sold in Chicago initially, because the street organizations were so strong. They, in their church, was so, you know, you didn't just come on the street in Chicago and sell no dope. You didn't walk on the street no corner in Chicago, because all the streets were connected to street organizations formation. So a lot of the cocaine that came out of Detroit, crack cocaine started in Detroit, not in LA. A lot of people think that it came out of Miami. YBI started the crack. It was called Primos. And they were putting the pellets inside marijuana cigarettes that were making via machines. And that's why Detroit got hit hard, Toledo got hit hard, Dayton, Sandusky, and Cleveland. So I'm just giving you a little backdrop to why this chemical warfare was directed at the young males that were coming into manhood and coming into prominence in the 80s. And that's why a lot of the stuff about street organizations didn't faze me, about Bloods, Crips, and all that kind of stuff, because I knew that it had a root in something that was bigger than what they were trying to do. That's why we got actively involved with street organizations in the 80s in Cleveland with the coalition, because we knew that these were the formations that would produce the men that would produce the soldiers that we need to take us where we need to go in this new millennium. And one of these brothers, and two of these brothers that I know for a fact, and probably more in this audience, one is our brother Damu Crenshaw, and I know my other brother's real humble. His name was Khalid Shakur.